Hello, I'm John McGovern, and today I'm going to be analysing Book 3 of the Faerie Queene. Book 3 centres around the theme of chastity, which was a very important theme in Elizabethan literature. In the 1570s, it had even been used politically by poets to dissuade the Queen from marrying a French Catholic called the Duke of Anjou. But by the time the Faerie Queene was written, Elizabeth was well into her 50s. She was still praised as being a chaste queen, but by this point it was used more as flattery than as a real way of guiding her actions. The main character, the knight of Book 3, is called Britomart, a female knight, and her name derives from the name of the Cretan goddess, Britomartis. Fans of Game of Thrones might see some kind of resemblance with Brienne of Tarth. Britomart's main quest in Book 3 is to find a knight called Artegall, who is the hero of Book 5. And she saw his image in a magic mirror, and after seeing his face, she knows she has to go and find him. And the idea is that she is seeking marital love. She is seeking a marriage with Artegall. And in order to reach this goal of marriage, which is Spenser's idea of the ideal kind of love, she has to avoid all other kinds of love and all other kinds of lust, including courtly love. As C.S. Lewis wrote in 1936, the book allegorizes the final defeat of courtly love by the romantic conception of marriage. And so, as I said, the main plot involves Britomart trying to avoid all kinds of obstacles on this path. And at the same time, there are multiple breakaway episodes, or we might think of them as subplots, which in their own small way also reflect the main theme of the book. The first main obstacle on Britomartis' quest comes when she goes to a castle called the Castle Joyous, which is ruled by a vain woman, a vain lady called Malecasta. And Malecasta has passed a law, so every man has to love her and is not allowed to love anybody else. And because Britomart is dressed like a man in a suit of armour, Malecasta assumes that she is a man and starts to lust after her and unsuccessfully tries to seduce her. That was in Canto 1, and the next major obstacle on Britomart's quest comes in Canto 11, where she has to triumph over a giant called Oliphant, who represents male lechery. And Oliphant is named after another giant in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and the idea is that lechery is no match for chastity. In the first edition of the poem, published in 1590, there was a nice self-contained plot. So Britomart and Artegall met each other at the end of the book and ran into each other's arms, and that was the conclusion of the book, representing the triumph of marital love. But in the following edition, this section was trimmed off the end of the book, and the final meeting between Britomart and Artegall was pushed into Book 4 instead. So now we can discuss some of the breakaway episodes which illustrate the main theme of chastity in the book. The first of these is slightly tedious. It's the story of Belphoebe and Timaeus. So Timaeus is a courtier who is wounded, and when Belphoebe cures him with a magic herb, he falls in love with her. And this story illustrates the tension that could exist between passionate courtship and the medieval tradition of courtly love, which involved a knight valiantly putting himself at the service of a beautiful lady. The second breakaway episode is between Scudamore and Amoret, and Amoret gets captured and tortured by an enchanter called Bizarine. And this episode represents the tragedy that can occur if the harmony of a relationship is broken by the lust of a third party. The next story is the story of Marinell and Florimell. And this story represents undying love, because Florimell only loves Marinell, even though she's wooed by a variety of other characters, including Prince Arthur himself. She still remains loyal. And she also escapes the lust of a series of base characters, starting with a man called a foster, or a forester. So a man who looks after the forest, and he has this vile, lustful temperament. And then she escapes the lust of a fisherman, and finally by the son of a witch. Another important character is known as the Squire of Dames, and the Squire of Dames is the quintessential representation of courtly love. His whole purpose in life is to travel around fairyland, finding maidens in distress and offering his services to them. And the Squire of Dames gets captured by a giantess called Argante, and Argante represents female lechery, as opposed to Oliphant, who, as we said, represented male lechery. And she plans to make him thrall of her desire, as Spenser says. But luckily, he gets rescued by a knight called Sir Satyrane, and that allows him to continue his purpose of this function of courtly love. The next Breakaway episode is between Braggadocio and false Florimell, sometimes called Snowy Florimell. And we talked about these two characters in previous videos. Braggadocio represents arrogance masquerading as competence, and Florimell represents beauty unaccompanied by virtue. And in this book, she seems like something of a trophy wife. Braggadocio is really proud of her, but really Spenser indicates that this relationship is really shallow and there's no substance to it. A particularly memorable Breakaway episode is between Malbecco and his youthful wife Hellenore. This is the story of a jealous old rich man who is married to a beautiful young woman who is unfaithful. And this is one of the classic plots of it's featured in many works of literature. For example, in Chaucer, it's similar to the story of Phoebus and his wife in the Mancipore's Tale. Spenser memorably describes Malbecco, "But he is old and withered like hay, unfit fair ladies service to supply. The privy guilt whereof makes him alway suspect her truth and keep continual spy." So when he talks about supplying ladies service, he's ostensibly talking about courtly love, but of course there's also a double meaning, so saying he's unable to sexually satisfy his wife, and that's the root cause of her unfaithfulness. Eventually, Hellenore is carried away by her young lover, Paridel. Spenser says that she is raped by Paridel, but it's the old-fashioned form of the word rape, from the Latin verb rapio, so simply to carry away. It's not really talking about physical rape. One of the most interesting features in the book is the role of Merlin, the famous legendary wizard. And it's sort of, the Merlin episodes sit uncomfortably with the rest of the book. They don't really fit into the main theme. Spenser was very interested in Celtic legend, and you almost get the impression that he wanted to get this in somehow, and so he chose book 3 as the best way to shoehorn this material into the book. But it is very interesting. For example, he tells the story of where Merlin planned to build a wall in Carmarthen, and he commanded some spirits to assist him in the task, and he forbade them from leaving their work even for a moment until the wall was completed. But before the wall was completed, Merlin was betrayed by the Lady of the Lake and subsequently killed. But because the spirits were never released of their command, he says that if you go to Carmarthen today, to a certain cave, you can still hear them at their work, you can still hear the beating of hammers. And Britomart goes to see Merlin, and he tells a prophecy of future English history, culminating in the accession of Elizabeth. And there's a very interesting moment where Merlin tries to look past to what happens after the reign of Elizabeth, and suddenly he seizes up with fear, just momentarily, until then he becomes happy again, and Britomart has no idea what just happened. And this is interesting because at this time many Englishmen were worried about the succession to the throne because Elizabeth had no heir. So this passage might be read as a subtle warning to the political classes that they'd better have some kind of plan in place for when Elizabeth dies to avoid civil war or any other kind of catastrophe which could happen without a clear heir to the throne. So that's a brief introduction to Book 3 of the Faerie Queene. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll be back next week with a discussion of Book 4 of the poem.